She said I was too pretty to be disabled, right before she tried to pull me out of my seat. Seconds later, security stormed the cabin, and the entire plane watched her scream as she was dragged away. If you believe in standing up for people with invisible disabilities, like, subscribe, and share this story, because silence helps bullies win. The airport was louder than usual that morning, full of restless travelers dragging wheeled suitcases over tile and children pressing sticky hands to the glass walls. I moved carefully through the crowd, trying not to limp too noticeably, though the dull ache in my hips and knees made that nearly impossible. A young flight attendant noticed my cane and gave a polite smile as she gestured me toward the priority boarding line. I smiled back, grateful not to have to explain myself for once. The note in my file allowed me to board early, but that didn't stop the eyes. It never did. A man in a business suit behind me sighed and tapped his foot like I had personally made his morning more difficult. A couple whispered to each other as I handed over my ticket. I heard the word faker float behind me, softly enough to feign innocence but loud enough to make sure it was heard. I didn't react. After living with an invisible disability for over a decade, I had developed a kind of internal firewall, a quiet place I could retreat to when the world seemed determined to doubt my pain. I moved down the jet bridge with deliberate care, every step a silent calculation. My seat was 18C, an aisle seat toward the back, which I had specifically chosen for its proximity to the restroom and the ability to stretch one leg into the aisle if my joints locked up mid-flight. I placed my small carry-on in the overhead bin and slowly lowered myself into the seat, grateful to be off my feet. The leg braces beneath my loose jeans were beginning to dig in, and I shifted to try to alleviate the pressure. Just as I was pulling out my water bottle and headphones, I heard a sharp, exaggerated voice behind me. "Oh, are you kidding me?" the woman said, her words clipped and loud enough for everyone around her to hear. "This is my seat." I looked up. A tall, blonde woman in her early 50s was standing in the aisle, one perfectly manicured hand on her hip, the other clutching a Louis Vuitton tote. She looked past me, down at the seat marker, then back at me with a practiced sneer. 18C, she said, her tone making it sound like an accusation. I nodded and reached for my boarding pass from the pocket of my hoodie. "Yes, that's me, 18C. She scoffed. "I doubt it." A flight attendant appeared before I could speak again, a young man who looked barely out of college. "Can I help with something, ma'am?" "She's in my seat," the woman said, "and I'd like it fixed, please." The attendant turned to me. "May I see your boarding pass?" I handed it to him without a word. He glanced at it, then smiled politely. "She's correct. This is her seat. Yours is actually 19A. The woman didn't move. "That's a window seat. I don't do windows. I specifically asked for an aisle." "I'm sorry, ma'am," he said gently. "The flight is full. We can't make changes at this time." She glanced down at me again, this time slower. Her gaze lingered on my cane, which was now leaning against my leg. Her expression twisted, like she'd tasted something sour. "Of course. How convenient." I kept my mouth shut. The best way to avoid escalation was silence, but it was getting harder by the second. "Some of us actually need aisle seats," she added loudly, speaking over her shoulder to a man I presumed was her husband, a gray-haired man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. But whatever. Let's just let the TikTok generation pretend they're crippled for sympathy. The words hit harder than I expected. I felt the familiar flush rise to my face, my ears burning with a mix of humiliation and fury. I could feel everyone around us pretending not to watch, pretending not to listen. The flight attendant repeated that she needed to find her assigned seat. She let out a dramatic sigh, tossed her hair, and finally stomped past me. Her bag bumped my shoulder on the way by. She didn't apologize. As she took her seat behind me, I heard her mutter something to her husband. I couldn't catch every word, but Faker was loud enough. So was playing the system. I stared at the seat back in front of me and tried to breathe. The worst part wasn't the accusation. It was the memory of how often I'd heard it before, in grocery store lines, in parking lots, even in doctors' offices. The disbelief wasn't new, but it still found new ways to sting. I pulled my hoodie tighter around my shoulders and adjusted the compression gloves on my hands. My fingers had started to stiffen. I took a sip of water and looked straight ahead, pretending the cabin walls were far away and that her voice couldn't reach me. A small child across the aisle peeked around his seat and waved. I smiled, grateful for the unexpected kindness. His mother gave me a soft, knowing look. It was the first moment I didn't feel completely alone on the plane. The intercom buzzed, and the captain welcomed us aboard. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes, silently praying the flight would be uneventful. But behind me, I could still hear her voice loud, sharp, and entitled as she complained about the temperature, the seating, and the joke of modern airlines giving special treatment to just anyone. I knew I should let it go. I had been through worse. But something in me was done with being quiet. I didn't know it yet, but this time, I wouldn't be the one forced to leave. The plane was nearly full now. Families were squeezing bags into overhead compartments. Business travelers were already opening laptops, and the flight attendants were moving briskly down the aisle with practiced efficiency. I tried to focus on the small tasks that usually helped calm me down. Adjust the seat belt, place my water bottle in the seat pocket, slide my cane gently to the side so it wouldn't get knocked over, breathe in, breathe out. But I could feel her behind me like a shadow with teeth. Every exaggerated sigh, every muttered insult, landed just close enough to be unmistakably heard but not loud enough to be officially called out. She was smart in that way. Passive aggression wrapped in perfume and pearls. "She's clearly faking it," she said, not bothering to lower her voice now. "Some people will do anything to get special treatment." Her husband gave a low grunt of acknowledgement, but didn't join in. He sounded tired, the kind of tired that made it seem like this wasn't his first time weathering her entitlement in public. I imagined this was routine for him, staying quiet while she created storms. I stared at the laminated safety card in front of me. I'd read it hundreds of times, but it gave me something to look at besides the people now subtly turning in their seats to see what was going on. I felt their eyes flicker toward me, then quickly away, unsure of whether to get involved. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked annoyed, as if the disturbance itself was more offensive than the woman causing it. A flight attendant passed by again, and I considered asking for help. But what would I say? That a woman behind me had called me a liar under her breath. That she was making the air feel sharp and cold without ever touching me. I had tried that once, years ago, after a similar encounter in a waiting room. The nurse had smiled politely and said, "Maybe she just didn't understand what you were going through," as if the responsibility to be palatable belonged to me. The engines began to hum beneath us, and the overhead lights blinked as the final passengers shuffled down the aisle. One of them, a young man with headphones around his neck, stopped at the row ahead of mine and looked down at his boarding pass. A few moments of shuffling later, he climbed into his seat and shut his eyes before the buckle even clicked. The world narrowed to the confines of the cabin, that long silver tube with too little space and far too many expectations. And then it started again. "Excuse me," she said, tapping the shoulder of the passenger seated across from her. "Could you switch seats with me? I don't do well in the middle." He blinked at her. "I'm sorry. This is my assigned seat. I understand that, but I have anxiety, and I need to be on the aisle. You're right there. It wouldn't be hard." "I also have anxiety," he replied, folding his arms. "And I also paid for my seat." She huffed, turning to the flight attendant, now making her way toward the back. "Excuse me. I'm trying to be reasonable, but I really need to be in an aisle seat." The attendant stopped, her smile tight and professional. "I'm sorry, ma'am. We've completed boarding, and all seats are assigned and occupied. If you'd like to speak to the gate agent, we can arrange something for a future flight." The woman looked pointedly in my direction. It's just frustrating when people who don't really need accommodations are taking the few aisle seats that should be reserved for passengers like me. The words were a dagger wrapped in silk. I turned slowly in my seat. Her eyes met mine, defiant, daring me to say something. I looked at her, really looked, searching for any trace of humanity in the carefully contoured face. "I have a disability," I said quietly. She tilted her head. "Sure you do. You look fine to me." My throat tightened. I forced my voice to stay calm, even. "Not all disabilities are visible." She gave a little laugh, as if I'd told her a clever joke. "Isn't that convenient?" Her words hung in the air like a stench. The people around us heard them, but no one moved. No one spoke. The flight attendant shifted her weight and opened her mouth, but Karen cut her off. "I'm not trying to be rude," she added, in a tone that meant precisely the opposite. But this whole system is getting abused. Every time I fly, it's someone else using a cane or some paperwork to get special treatment. It's not fair. I turned back around, afraid that if I kept looking at her, I would cry. Not out of weakness, but out of sheer helpless frustration. This was the worst kind of cruelty, the kind that wore civility like a mask. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't screaming. She was being concerned, reasonable, just asking logical questions, and somehow her logic always concluded that people like me were lying. She leaned forward again. You know what would be fair? If people who actually look sick got the benefits, it would make it easier for all of us. That was when I felt the crack. Something inside me shifted. My whole life I'd stayed quiet in situations like this, hoping that silence would keep me safe. But silence never protected me. It just allowed people like her to keep talking. I turned again slowly. I have Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, I said. It's a connective tissue disorder that affects my joints and causes chronic pain, fainting, and internal bleeding. I wear braces under my jeans. I use a cane not because it's fashionable, but because I've dislocated my knee just by standing still. I got this seat because my doctor signed a form explaining all of that. I didn't take anything from you. You just don't like not getting what you want. The words didn't come out in a rush. They came out clear and deliberate, every syllable heavy with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Righteousness. Truth. She stared at me, stunned, as if she hadn't expected a response at all. The flight attendant looked from me to her and stepped closer. Ma'am, if there's a problem with your seat, I can arrange for you to speak with customer service once we land. But we are preparing for takeoff, and I need you to remain quiet and seated. Karen didn't say anything, but the set of her jaw said she was storing it away for later. I didn't care anymore. As the plane backed away from the gate and began its slow crawl toward the runway, I closed my eyes. My heart was pounding, not with fear, but something else. Power. I hadn't won anything. Not yet. But I had drawn a line. And she had crossed it. As the plane picked up speed along the tarmac, a quiet unease settled into the rows like mist. Conversations dwindled to murmurs. The clatter of seatbelt buckles ceased. A child near the front began to hum softly, and the mother beside him gently tapped his leg to hush him. I sat motionless, staring at the seat back in front of me, my fingers resting on the metal tip of my cane. I could feel my pulse in my jaw. Karen hadn't spoken since my last response, but her presence behind me felt sharper now. There was no mistaking the shift. She wasn't just irritated. She was wounded, in the way only entitled people get, when the world refuses to bend for them. And when someone like her feels humiliated, they never retreat. They regroup. I could hear her fidgeting with something behind me, maybe her purse or a magazine, but the way she moved was jerky, impatient. She muttered under her breath, just loud enough to be noticed but not quite understood. I didn't need to hear the words. The tone was enough. The plane lifted into the air, and I braced myself against the seat as we climbed. My right hip started to throb the way it always did during takeoff. The pressure change did something awful to my joints, like every bone was trying to crawl out of place. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a position that didn't send pain spiraling down my leg. I could feel the dull click in my shoulder blade where the joint wasn't quite aligned. My body was a collage of malfunctioning hinges and pulled threads. Just as I leaned forward to discreetly adjust the brace under my jeans, something tapped against my elbow. Not hard, but deliberately. I looked down. Karen's designer handbag was wedged firmly in the shared space between our rows, pushing against my armrest. I didn't say anything. I didn't want to give her another opportunity, but I gently pushed the bag away with the side of my forearm and tried to reclaim my small sliver of comfort. Seconds later, the bag shoved back. I turned to glance over my shoulder. She was staring directly at me, not bothering to hide it this time. Her lips curved in a half smile, the kind that had no joy behind it. "You're not entitled to the whole aisle," she said under her breath. I said nothing, but I didn't move either. Her bag stayed where it was, and I didn't touch it again. Let her push. Let her fume. She sighed dramatically and turned to her husband. Some people really think the world owes them everything. "I'm not doing this," he muttered, barely audible. "Oh, so now I'm the bad guy?" she snapped. He didn't respond. She leaned forward again, loud enough for the row across from us to hear. All these modern illnesses. Everyone's got something now. Fibro, this, chronic, that. It's all just a way to be lazy and get praised for it. When I was young, people pushed through pain. They didn't ask for applause. I gripped the armrest with my left hand. My right was starting to lose feeling, a common symptom when I sat too long without support. I flexed my fingers and tried to breathe through the nausea. I had always considered myself patient. I had tolerated snide comments in elevators, judgmental glances in parking lots, people questioning why someone my age needed a cane or used accessible bathrooms. But something about being trapped in this flying tin can with her venom felt like an entirely new level of helplessness. She wasn't even hiding her cruelty now. That was the thing. She had convinced herself that her opinions were common sense, and everyone else was too soft to say them out loud. And because no one had stopped her before, she assumed she had the right to keep going. A flight attendant came by with the drink cart. I asked for ginger ale, hoping the sugar would ease the churning in my stomach. The woman behind me asked for sparkling water, and when it was handed to her, she paused. "No lemon?" she asked. The attendant apologized and explained they were out. Karen stared at her as if she had said something unforgivable. Then she muttered again, "You people are useless," and waved her hand in dismissal. The attendant smiled politely and continued down the aisle, but I saw her blink hard once, as if trying to hold something in. It made me angrier than I expected. The flight attendants were already juggling a full plane of passengers, and she couldn't even accept a minor inconvenience without trying to make someone feel small. There was a pattern to people like her. Their discomfort always became someone else's fault. Minutes passed. I tried to distract myself with the in-flight magazine, but the pressure in my joints was building. My ankles were stiff. My lower back had begun to spasm. I shifted again and pulled my compression gloves tighter, hoping for any sense of control. Suddenly, I felt a sharp jab in my side. Her bag again. This time it was shoved so aggressively into my space that it dug into my ribs. I turned, startled. "Do you mind?" I asked, the edge in my voice finally showing. She blinked in mock surprise. "Excuse me? You've got half your junk in the aisle, and you're accusing me of being inconsiderate." I glanced down. My cane was tucked close to my leg. My bag was stowed under the seat. There was nothing in the aisle. "I haven't taken any more space than I'm allowed," I said quietly but firmly. "Your bag is digging into my side." "It's a small bag," she said. "You're just being dramatic." Again. The flight attendant walking by paused and looked at both of us. "Is everything all right here?" she asked. Karen gave her a bright smile. "Oh, everything's fine. She's just a little sensitive." The flight attendant looked to me. I held her gaze and shook my head slightly. "She's been pushing her bag into my side for the last 20 minutes, I said. "And she's been commenting on my disability the entire flight." Karen gasped, as if I had insulted her personally. "Oh, how dare you! I have said nothing of the sort." "I heard you," said a voice across the aisle. We both turned. It was the woman with the small child from earlier. She met Karen's eyes without blinking. "You've been whispering about her since you sat down. I've been trying to keep my son calm and ignore it, but you crossed a line." Karen blinked, mouth slightly open, surprised someone had actually challenged her. Another voice chimed in from behind. "Yeah, it's been non-stop. Some of us are trying to have a peaceful flight." Karen turned to her husband, who now stared at the seat back ahead as if willing it to become a portal to somewhere else. The flight attendant nodded. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you to keep your belongings within your designated space and refrain from commenting on other passengers." Karen looked flustered but said nothing. She jerked her bag away from my side and crossed her arms tightly, lips pressed into a pale line. I turned back to my seat, heart pounding. The adrenaline of confrontation always left me shaken, even when I didn't show it. But this time felt different. I hadn't been alone. Others had seen. Others had spoken. For the first time in a long time, I felt like maybe silence wasn't the only option left to people like me. The cabin lights had dimmed, the seatbelt sign was still on, but the rumble of the engines had settled into a steady hum. Outside the tiny oval windows, the sky was a layered curtain of grey and blue, clouds scattered like worn cotton. I focused on the hum and the softness of the view beyond the glass, willing myself to disappear into that horizon. My body was already stiff, and I knew that if I didn't shift soon, it would become unbearable. But movement would invite more attention, more comments, more venom, and I had so little left in reserve. The pain had become constant now, pulsing through my hips and spine like a tide. I shifted slightly, careful not to lean too far into the aisle. My cane clattered softly as I adjusted it, and I felt a sharp poke from behind. Karen's knee jabbed into the back of my seat. "Seriously," she muttered. "What are you even fidgeting for? Sit still like the rest of us." I didn't answer. I didn't turn around, but my hands trembled. "You think because you've got some special sticker on your ticket, you get to treat this like your private flight," she went on, now a little louder. "Some of us have real conditions. I have anxiety. I can't even breathe when I'm stuck in the middle seat. But you don't see me begging for attention." A man 1 row up turned slightly in his seat. He didn't speak, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his expression. He heard it too. We all did. Karen wasn't just being rude anymore. She was becoming a threat. My heart started to race, that awful hollow flutter that precedes a flare. It wasn't just embarrassment anymore. It was fear. I could feel the early warning signs. My joints were locking up. My limbs were starting to numb. I was losing sensation in my left foot. I leaned forward, trying to adjust my seat cushion. The movement sent a jolt up my back, and my hands shook as I reached into my bag for the emergency medication my doctor had prescribed. Not painkillers, not anything narcotic, just a stabilizer, something to keep my blood pressure from crashing if things got worse. Behind me, Karen laughed. It was a bitter, theatrical sound. "Oh, now we're taking pills," she said louder now, right in front of everyone. "You know, if you're going to fake something, maybe try not to be so obvious about it." That was the moment I felt the burn rise in my throat. Not shame, not anxiety. Something sharper, something closer to rage. "I'm not faking anything," I said, without turning around. "You keep saying that, but here we are," she replied. "Shaking in your seat, popping pills, looking like a victim. I see girls like you all the time. You pretend to be fragile because it gets you sympathy. You probably don't even work. Just drift through life expecting the world to move for you." Her voice sliced through the cabin, silencing what little conversation was still happening. Even the baby a few rows up had stopped crying. A hand touched my arm. It was the older woman across the aisle, the one who had defended me earlier. "Do you need anything?" she asked gently. "Water? A flight attendant?" I swallowed. "I just need to breathe." Karen scoffed again, but quieter this time, as if she had been reminded, for just a moment, that people were watching. But it didn't last. "You know," she said, now talking to the air rather than anyone in particular, "it's exhausting trying to travel anymore. You've got people pretending to be disabled, people abusing the system. No one has any respect, no sense of decorum. It used to be that you dressed up for a flight, acted like a decent person. Now it's all just pity parties and TikToks and people trying to go viral." The trembling had spread to my shoulders now. My spine felt locked in place, and I couldn't sit upright without searing pain shooting down my legs. I adjusted my neck pillow, trying to prop myself forward, but my vision was starting to blur. My hands were tingling. My head throbbed. I heard a chime, the soft ding that meant a flight attendant was approaching. But instead of footsteps, it was Karen who moved. And then I felt it, her hand brushing the edge of my seat. Something grabbed my cane and yanked. It happened so fast I didn't process it at first. The cane slid from where it had been resting against my leg. She had reached forward and pulled it, holding it up for the row behind her to see. "This," she said, waving it like a prop, "this isn't even real. You don't need this. I've seen better acting in a high school play." The shock was so total, so unthinkable, that for a moment no one moved. Then a voice shouted, "Put that down." A man 2 rows behind stood up. He was older, tall and broad-shouldered, with a veteran's bearing and a stare that didn't flinch. He stepped into the aisle. "Put it down. Now." Karen's mouth opened as if to argue, but the intensity of his voice made her hesitate. He wasn't yelling. He didn't have to. "Sir." I said, "Put it down." Karen dropped the cane like it had burned her. It clattered against the floor and rolled toward my feet. I bent to pick it up, the motion nearly buckling my hip. The veteran stepped closer. "Are you all right?" he asked me. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if it was true. Behind him, other passengers had stood up. Some had turned in their seats. The air had changed. No one was pretending anymore. The flight attendant finally arrived, eyes wide, face tight. "What's going on?" she asked. The veteran pointed at Karen. This woman just grabbed that passenger's cane and mocked her disability. Karen straightened in her seat, her voice rising with manufactured outrage. "This is ridiculous. I was just trying to prove a point. She's faking. She doesn't need—" She laid hands on another passenger's medical aid, the veteran said, cutting her off. "That's assault." "I didn't hurt her," Karen snapped. "You're all blowing this out of proportion." Another voice joined in from a few rows up. "No one here thinks she's in the right. We've all heard her for the past hour. Enough's enough." The flight attendant stepped back and tapped her earpiece. "I need to speak with the captain," she said. Karen turned to her husband, but he was already leaning as far from her as the seat would allow. His eyes were closed. His hands were folded in his lap. He didn't say a word. I leaned against the window, clutching my cane like a lifeline. My body hurt in too many places to count, but I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just waited. And in the silence that followed, I began to sense what was coming. She had finally crossed a line that could not be ignored. The hum of the engines couldn't drown out the tension vibrating through the cabin. Even though the flight was still climbing, the plane felt suspended in a strange, pressurized silence. Passengers who had earlier buried themselves in earbuds or magazines were now sitting upright, watching, listening. The drama that had started as a few snide remarks had shifted into something undeniable. A woman had reached over a seat and grabbed another passenger's medical device. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something serious, something that crossed more than just social lines. I sat frozen in my seat, clutching my cane against my thigh. My fingers felt raw. I wasn't sure if it was from the pressure or the tremble that hadn't stopped since she touched me. The flight attendant who had radioed the captain hadn't returned yet. Another one had come by to check on me. She had asked if I needed water or ice, if I wanted to move to a jump seat near the galley, if I was in pain. I nodded to the last question but declined the rest. I didn't want to go anywhere, not now. I needed to be exactly where I was when this all came to a head. Karen, on the other hand, had not backed down. She had stopped speaking directly to me, but now she was performing. She began talking to anyone within earshot, addressing the air around her as if holding court. Her voice was tight with indignation, but she had switched tones. Now she was the misunderstood one, the victim. "I just wanted some space," she said. "That's all I was asking for. I have anxiety." I told them that. "But of course, the moment you speak up, you get treated like a criminal." No one answered her. She tried again. "You all saw it. I didn't hit her. I didn't threaten her. I barely touched the cane. I was trying to prove a point, and now they're making me out to be some kind of monster." Still no response. Even the man beside her, who I assumed was her husband, remained silent. He was staring at the floor, as though the patterned carpet might provide some kind of escape. Across the aisle, the woman with the young child leaned in toward me. Her voice was low, careful. "My sister has lupus," she said. "The way that woman talked to you, I've seen it happen to my sister too. I'm so sorry." I swallowed hard and managed a small nod. I couldn't find words, not yet. I felt seen, but it hurt, being seen after so much effort to be invisible. So many flights I had masked my symptoms, smiling through swelling joints and shallow breaths just to avoid pity or skepticism. Now, after being openly attacked, people were finally recognizing that I existed, and it felt both comforting and heartbreaking at once. A man a few rows ahead turned and looked back. He was older, dressed in a soft grey suit, with thick-rimmed glasses that gave him a professorial air. "What she did was uncalled for," he said gently. "Some of us here are veterans. We've seen people lose limbs and dignity. No one deserves to be treated like you were, whether you wear your wounds on the outside or not." Karen turned sharply. "Oh, please, don't turn this into some crusade. I said something because I was uncomfortable. That girl's making a scene because she didn't get her way." The man's expression didn't change. "She was minding her own business until you started talking, and you haven't stopped since." Others were nodding now. A few murmured words of agreement passed between rows. I realized that the tide had shifted. The silence earlier, The hesitation to speak was giving way to something else. Not a mob, not rage, just a collective decision that enough was enough. Karen, sensing this, raised her voice. You people don't understand. This isn't about her. It's about how everyone plays the system. I travel all the time. I see it every flight. People pretending to be disabled, pretending to need assistance. Meanwhile, those of us with real mental health issues get shoved aside. A young woman sitting a few rows back stood up. She was wearing a sweatshirt with a college logo and had a service dog at her feet. Her voice was steady but firm. I have PTSD, she said, and I'm asking you to stop talking. You're not helping people with anxiety. You're embarrassing us. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but stopped when the same flight attendant from earlier returned. Her eyes scanned the row, and then she leaned slightly toward Karen. Ma'am, the captain has been informed of the situation. When we land, you'll be asked to deplane for further discussion with authorities. Until then, I need you to remain quiet and seated. Karen's jaw dropped. What? You're punishing me? The attendant didn't blink. You laid hands on a passenger's medical device. That's considered a violation of airline safety policy. We have witnesses. Please remain calm or we'll have to make additional arrangements mid-flight. Karen turned red. She was trembling now, though not from shame, from fury. She looked at her husband for backup. He stared out the window, unmoving. The silence from his side of the row was deafening. I want to speak to the captain, she hissed. You'll have the opportunity to speak with authorities when we land, the attendant repeated. I'm asking you again to remain seated and refrain from addressing other passengers. The woman across the aisle exhaled slowly. She looked at me and gave a single nod, the kind that says, you made it through the worst. I wasn't so sure. My body still felt like a bag of broken glass. Every jolt of turbulence sent new pain up my spine. I was exhausted in a way that sleep wouldn't fix, but something inside me had shifted. A line had been drawn, and for once, I wasn't the one being dragged across it. The plane continued to hum through the air. The light overhead flickered once, then steadied. People began to settle again, though it was different now. No one went back to their books or their movies. There was a shared awareness in the cabin, a quiet understanding that they had just witnessed something real, something raw, and not one of them had gotten up to stop it until the damage had already been done. I didn't know whether to feel grateful or disappointed, but I did know one thing. I wasn't invisible anymore. Not to the woman who mocked me, not to the people around me, and not to myself. I had spoken. I had refused to be erased. And though my hands were still shaking and my body still screamed with pain, I had stayed seated. My seat, my right, and for once, the world had started to listen. The plane had leveled off, but the tension hadn't. People were no longer pretending they didn't hear. The soft hum of the engines continued, but the usual comfort it offered was missing. A thick silence had settled over the cabin, not the quiet of sleep or peace, but the kind that comes after something sharp and ugly has passed through a space and left it rattled. I sat stiffly, afraid to move too much. The ache in my spine had become a deep, dull throb. My fingers were tingling again, and the back of my neck felt clammy. The muscles in my legs had begun their slow protest, locking up little by little, like old gears grinding against each other. The pressure of holding myself upright for the last 2 hours had caught up with me, but I refused to let my body slump. Not now. Behind me, I could hear Karen shifting in her seat, fidgeting, breathing heavily through her nose. She had gone quiet after the flight attendant's last warning, but the silence did not feel like surrender. It felt like something brewing, like a woman rehearsing her next line. I tried to steady my breathing. I focused on the feeling of the cane against my leg, the smooth coolness of the handle. I reminded myself that I had done nothing wrong, that she had grabbed me, that she had tried to humiliate me, that I had stayed in my seat, not just physically but emotionally. I had not risen to her cruelty. I had not cracked. But I could feel the pressure mounting inside her. Some people didn't need an audience to lash out. They just needed the feeling of being told no. And she had been told no, by me, by the passengers around us, by the flight attendants, and by her own husband who hadn't said a word in nearly 30 minutes. That kind of silence cuts more deeply than any outburst. Then I heard her voice again, low but pointed. She was talking to the man beside her, though her words were clearly meant for me. "This is harassment," she said. "I should be the one pressing charges. This entire flight has been hostile toward me. The way that girl turned everyone against me disgusting." He didn't reply. I doubted she expected him to. "I'm going to sue," she said. "This airline is going to regret humiliating me like this." No one responded. Not the man next to her. Not the passengers in nearby rows. The silence that met her words was not passive anymore. It was firm. Final. And then it happened. The seat behind me shifted. I felt her arm brush the back of mine. I turned slightly, unsure of what was coming. Her face appeared beside my shoulder. Her voice was quiet but strained. "You're not sick," she said. "You're just weak. And you're going to ruin your life pretending there's something wrong with you." My breath caught. I didn't flinch. I didn't lean away. I simply sat still and stared ahead. But inside, my hands were burning. My jaw ached from the tension. Before I could respond, a man across the aisle stood up again. It was the same veteran who had defended me earlier. He looked down at her with eyes that didn't waver. "She warned you," he said. "You put your hands on her again. Even your words. And I will make sure you're removed the second we land." Karen turned to him, disbelief all over her face. "You people are insane," she said louder now. "This is a plane, not a courtroom. I have the right to speak." "No," the man said. "You don't have the right to keep attacking someone after being told to stop." A chime rang out. The captain came over the intercom. His voice was calm, practiced. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. I want to thank you for your patience today. We're cruising at 35,000 feet and expect to arrive on time. However, we've been alerted to an onboard situation and have coordinated with airport authorities to have personnel meet us at the gate. We ask that all passengers remain in their seats until instructed to disembark. Thank you for your cooperation." The mood shifted like a current in the cabin. There was no mistaking who that message was for. Everyone knew. Karen froze. I heard her exhale, a shaky, breathless sound that didn't carry anger anymore. It carried something else. Panic. She leaned into her seat, and for the first time since boarding, she didn't say anything. Not to her husband, not to me, not to the passengers who had spent the past hour watching her unravel. I sat with my hands in my lap, my fingers curled slightly to keep blood flowing. The pain hadn't lessened, but something in me had steadied. I felt rooted. Not strong exactly, but solid in a way that wasn't familiar. Like I had finally stopped apologizing to the world for needing space in it. A small tap on my shoulder made me turn. It was the woman across the aisle. She handed me a wrapped ginger candy and a tiny pack of tissues. "You were incredible," she said softly. "Don't let her make you feel smaller than you are." I tried to speak but found my throat tight. I nodded instead, blinking quickly. Her kindness undid me more than Karen's cruelty ever could. The hours that followed passed slowly. The flight attendants resumed service with a quiet professionalism, offering drinks and snacks as if the air between rows hadn't been carved open. Most passengers kept their eyes forward. A few leaned over to whisper to one another, and one or two glanced at me, then looked away, embarrassed. Not because I had done anything wrong, but because they had seen something raw and real, and hadn't known how to act. I didn't blame them. Karen didn't speak again. Her husband didn't move. They both sat stiffly, waiting. I could almost feel her calculating. Would she cry? Pretend to faint? Frame herself as the victim in front of the airport police? I didn't know. I didn't care. What mattered was this. I had stayed in my seat. I had defended myself. And when she had tried to reduce me to a stereotype, when she had mocked my pain, when she had torn through the thin veil of politeness and exposed her own bitterness for everyone to see, the people around me had not let it pass. They had stepped in. Not soon enough, maybe, but they had done it. The plane began its descent. The cabin lights brightened. People stirred. Overhead bins clicked open. The normal chaos of landing returned. But underneath it all, that same quiet tension remained. I could feel it coming. The final moment. The one I hadn't dared to hope for, but now knew was certain. Something was going to happen the second those wheels hit the tarmac. And for once, I wouldn't be the one questioned. I wouldn't be the one explaining. I wouldn't be the one leaving. The landing was smoother than I expected, given how rocky the flight had felt emotionally. The tires kissed the tarmac with only the faintest bounce, and the aircraft began to slow, humming down the runway like it had no idea the pressure it had just held inside for the past few hours. The tension in the cabin hadn't lessened, not even with the promise of arrival. If anything, it had grown denser, like we were all waiting for something to break. I looked out the window and saw the line of jet bridges approaching, the airport looming just beyond the edge of the glass. The sunlight was sharp now, casting long streaks across the tarmac, painting everything in a pale orange hue. People shifted in their seats, unbuckling belts too early, reaching for bags they couldn't yet retrieve. The usual murmurs of arrival were hushed. It was the strangest silence I'd ever experienced in a plane full of people. Not even the babies were crying. The intercom crackled again. The captain's voice was back, steady and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our destination. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. Law enforcement officials will be boarding the aircraft shortly. We appreciate your patience." That was it. Simple, direct, unmistakable. Karen went stiff. I didn't need to see her to feel it. Her seat shifted slightly as she pulled herself upright, and her breathing changed. The casual bravado she had worn like perfume for the entire flight was gone. I imagined her face draining of color. Her husband hadn't moved a muscle. He just stared straight ahead, hands folded in his lap, jaw clenched like he was trying to will himself invisible. I looked around the cabin. Most passengers were facing forward, but their eyes darted to the aisle, to the doors, to each other. People were sitting straighter, not out of fear but anticipation. The kind of collective pause that comes when everyone knows the rules have been broken and the consequences are finally catching up. There was no cheering, no applause, just a deep, waiting silence. The seatbelt sign blinked off. No one moved. The door opened. 2 uniformed officers stepped onto the plane. One wore the crisp navy blue of airport police, the other a lighter grey uniform marked with the airline's security emblem. They moved with precision, not rushing, not dragging their steps. One stopped at the front, speaking quietly to the lead flight attendant. She pointed down the aisle toward our row. The second officer began walking. His boots thudded softly against the carpet. Every step was measured. He was tall, dark-skinned, with a clean-shaven face, and the kind of expression that didn't invite argument. He scanned each row carefully, not in search of confusion, but confirmation. He reached our row and stopped. "Ma'am," he said, looking directly at Karen. "Please come with me." Karen blinked. Her lips parted slightly. For a moment, she didn't speak. She just looked around, waiting for someone to say it was a mistake. Her gaze landed on me. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look back at her fully. I kept my eyes ahead, and my hands resting on my cane. Her voice, when it finally came, was brittle. "Why? I didn't do anything wrong." The officer didn't answer that. He simply repeated himself. "Please stand up and come with me." She let out a nervous laugh. "This is insane. You're seriously doing this? Based on what?" She said I made her uncomfortable, and now I'm being escorted off a plane? The passengers in the rows around us didn't answer, but they watched. That kind of stillness only comes when people are witnessing something real, something important. Karen turned to her husband. "Say something," she hissed. He looked at her for the first time in almost an hour. He didn't speak, but the look on his face was weary, disappointed, and entirely detached. It said everything she didn't want to hear. The second officer joined the first. His voice was firmer. "Ma'am, you've been asked to comply. If you refuse to exit voluntarily, we will remove you." She gasped. "This is harassment. This is discrimination. I have rights." A man in the row behind her leaned forward. "We all watched you grab her cane." Another voice chimed in from across the aisle. "You mocked her disability." Over and over. Karen stood up abruptly, almost knocking her purse off her lap. She turned toward me, pointing. "She's pretending. You all fell for it. I was the one who felt threatened. She manipulated you." The veteran from earlier stood again. His presence filled the aisle. "You need to stop," he said calmly. "You've done enough." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but the officer stepped between them. "Step into the aisle, ma'am." She hesitated. Then, with a loud scoff, She yanked her bag from the seat and pushed past her husband, bumping into the aisle wall as she went. The officer behind her guided her forward, while the other remained close, blocking any path back. As she walked toward the front of the plane, her voice rose again. "You're all sheep. That's what this is. You'll regret this. Every one of you." No one answered. The only sound was the shuffle of her shoes against the carpet and the click of a phone camera. Someone had raised their phone, recording it all, their face expressionless. She disappeared through the open cabin door. For a moment, the silence held. Then a low exhale rippled through the cabin. Not relief, not victory. Something quieter. A breath held too long now, let go. The flight attendant returned and addressed us with a soft smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your cooperation. We'll now begin deplaning from the front row." People began to rise, stretching and reaching for their bags. I stayed seated. My body had locked again, and I needed time to move without pain. I waited for the aisle to clear. The veteran walked past me slowly. He paused, hand resting gently on the back of my seat. "You handled yourself with more grace than most people could manage. I hope you know that." I looked up at him and nodded. "Thank you," I said. He smiled once, then turned and disappeared down the aisle. One by one, passengers passed by. A few touched my arm or offered small smiles. One woman mouthed the word, "brave." Another said, "I saw everything. I'm sorry." By the time the plane was nearly empty, I managed to stand. My legs ached, my back was tight, and my fingers were stiff, but I stood. As I made my way slowly down the aisle, cane in hand, the flight attendant at the door stepped aside. "Take your time," she said. "You've already shown more strength than most of us ever have." I stepped onto the jet bridge, the bright light of the terminal spilling through the open doorway. The air smelled like concrete and jet fuel and something else. Something cleaner. It smelled like the end of something that never should have started. And maybe, just maybe, the beginning of something better. The terminal was buzzing with the usual chorus of rolling luggage, overlapping voices, and distant announcements calling out gates and destinations, but I didn't hear any of it clearly. It all passed through me like muffled sound underwater. I walked slowly, my cane tapping lightly against the glossy tile, each step deliberate. The pain in my knees and lower back had reached a quiet roar, the kind that made every motion feel like swimming against a current. Still, I moved forward. Passengers from the flight began dispersing around me, slipping off into the crowd or stopping to check their phones. A few stayed near the gate, still processing what had just unfolded. Some of them looked at me and then quickly looked away, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. One woman approached, gently touching my arm with a respectful hesitation. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said. "I should have said something sooner." I looked at her, saw the genuine regret in her eyes, and gave a small nod. I didn't want her to feel guilty. That wouldn't help either of us. "Thank you," I said. She lingered for a second longer, then disappeared into the crowd. The man in the grey suit, the one who had spoken like a professor, approached next. He stood beside me quietly for a moment before speaking. "You reminded all of us what dignity looks like today," he said. "Most people avoid confrontation. You didn't. You taught us something." He didn't wait for a response, just gave me a slight bow of his head and walked off with his carry-on trailing behind him. I made my way to the nearest row of chairs near baggage claim. I eased myself into one of them, grateful to be off my feet. My body didn't just ache, it trembled. Every part of me was buzzing with exhaustion and emotion that hadn't had room to fully surface yet. Now that the confrontation was over, my nerves seemed to realize what they'd been carrying and began to unravel. I pulled out my phone with clumsy fingers and checked the time. My hands were still shaking. It had been barely 15 minutes since I stepped off the plane. I opened my messages. There were already a few texts from my sister. She had seen something on social media, something posted by someone on the flight. I hadn't even looked yet, but she was asking if I was okay, if it was really me in the video, if I wanted her to come meet me at the airport. I sent a short reply letting her know I was safe. That was all I could manage. As I sat there, trying to breathe normally again, a young woman with a service dog walked by and stopped. "I don't want to bother you," she said, "but I was a few rows behind you. I have fibromyalgia. I've been treated like that more times than I can count. What you did, it meant something." Her voice cracked a little on the last sentence. She blinked, rubbed the top of her dog's head, then continued on before I could respond. My throat was too tight to say much anyway. A man in a security uniform came by and asked if I needed assistance getting to ground transportation. I thanked him and said no. I just needed to rest a minute. He offered a smile and left a business card with the airport's accessibility services info scribbled on the back. Then he walked off. Eventually, I stood again and made my way toward the rideshare area. It was quieter there. The pace of people slowed a little. I leaned against a pillar, waiting for my car, and finally opened the social media app that had been pinging in my notifications. There it was, a video. Someone had filmed Karen being escorted off the plane. The caption read, "Woman mocks disabled passenger, gets dragged off flight." It already had over 80,000 views. Comments flooded the screen as I scrolled. "She really said you don't look sick and then got escorted by cops. I hope that woman sues. People with invisible disabilities deserve better than this." Justice served mid-air. As I read the comments, I saw people tagging disability advocacy pages, sharing personal stories of similar treatment, calling out the larger pattern. It wasn't just about Karen. It had become something bigger. Someone had found my name, tagged me in a post. A photo from earlier in the flight showed me seated quietly, clutching my cane, eyes turned away from the camera. The caption was simple. She didn't shout, she didn't beg. She sat with grace while the world tried to shrink her. I'll never forget this flight. I wanted to cry, but not out of pain, not out of anger. For the first time in a long time, I wanted to cry because I felt seen, not pitied, not questioned, seen. My phone buzzed again. A message from someone I hadn't spoken to in years. It read, "Hey, I saw the video. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not believing you back in college. I get it now." That message hurt more than anything else. Not because it was cruel, but because it came too late. Still, I typed out a reply. "I appreciate that. Take care." The driver pulled up a few minutes later, a quiet woman with silver hair and a kind face. She opened the trunk for my bag and didn't say much until I was seated in the back. "You doing okay?" she asked, checking the mirror. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think I will be," I said. As we pulled away from the airport, I watched the planes lined up along the runways, hundreds of people walking on and off aircraft, each carrying their own unseen struggles, each one trying to get somewhere or return to someone, all of them moving through a world that often refused to make room. But today, something different had happened. The world hadn't changed, not all at once, but for 1 hour, in one plane, someone stood their ground. Others stood with her. And a woman who thought cruelty was harmless learned that it could cost her something. I leaned back into the seat and closed my eyes. The hum of the road beneath the car was soft, even, rhythmic. I breathed in slowly, let it out, and for the first time in days, I didn't feel like I had to brace for the next blow. Today, I had been allowed to exist exactly as I was, and that was enough. By the time I got home that evening, my legs were barely cooperating. I sat on the edge of the couch, peeled off my braces one by one, and let them fall onto the carpet. They clattered gently as they hit the floor. I leaned forward and exhaled, resting my elbows on my knees, letting the exhaustion finally wash over me. The silence in my apartment was a welcome relief. No cabin chatter, no rising voices, no clatter of carts or passive-aggressive comments. Just the faint hum of my refrigerator and the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. I stared at the floor for a while, feeling the way my body ached in layers. There was the familiar physical pain, of course, but there was also something heavier, an emotional exhaustion that had settled into my chest like weight. My phone buzzed again. I reached for it and was met with a barrage of notifications. Direct messages, tagged posts, new followers, comments from strangers. I opened one, then another, then a third. People from all over the country were writing to me. Some shared stories of their own flights, grocery store encounters, job interviews where their invisible disabilities had been questioned or dismissed. Some just said thank you. Some were angry on my behalf. It was overwhelming, but not in a bad way. It felt like stepping into a room and finding it full of people who had been waiting to say, "Me too." The video that had gone up earlier had exploded beyond anything I could have imagined. It had already crossed 1 million views. News outlets had picked it up. Some were just local, but others weren't. I saw my name in headlines for the first time in my life. Passenger with invisible disability stands her ground as disruptive woman is removed mid-flight. You don't look sick. A viral moment that's making America talk about chronic illness. I clicked through a few articles. Most were short, repeating what the video showed, quoting tweets from strangers who had watched the footage. But some went deeper. One even linked to a disability advocacy group I'd donated to in the past. The conversation had begun to shift. People weren't just sharing the video for shock value. They were talking about systemic misunderstanding, about judgment, about the daily battle of existing with a condition that can't be seen but demands to be managed every waking moment. I got up slowly, poured a glass of water, and sat back down. My hands still trembled slightly, but not from adrenaline anymore. I was trying to process what was happening. In one day, I had gone from bracing myself against a stranger's ridicule to being a voice in a national conversation. It didn't feel real. The next message that came through was from a disability advocate I'd followed online for years. She was a writer and speaker who had published a memoir about her own journey. Her message was kind and direct. I saw the video. You handled it with so much grace. Would you be willing to do a short video interview about it? We're putting together a series on travel and invisible disabilities. I stared at the screen. My instinct was to say no. I didn't like attention. I didn't seek it. I had only wanted to survive the flight, not become a symbol, but a small voice inside me pushed back. This wasn't about me anymore. It was about all the people who never got their moment to speak, who got removed from planes, who got shamed at concerts, who got fired from jobs because they looked too healthy to need accommodations. I typed out a careful response. Thank you for reaching out. I'd be honored. After sending it, I opened the Notes app on my phone and began typing. Not a speech, not a statement, just my thoughts. What I had wanted to say in the moment but couldn't. What I wished people understood without needing to see a meltdown on a plane. I wrote slowly, pausing often to rest my hands, but the words came easily once I started. I wrote about how disability isn't always visible, how pain can be constant even if you're smiling, how hard it is to ask for help when the world has taught you that doing so means weakness. I wrote about the fear, the guilt, the fatigue, and I wrote about dignity, about holding your place in a world that tries to push you to the edges. I finished the note, reread it once, and copied it into a post. I didn't expect to go viral today. I didn't want attention. I just wanted to get home safely. Living with an invisible illness means constantly defending your truth in spaces that demand proof. People think if you're not limping dramatically or hooked to a machine, you must be fine. But I am not fine. I am resilient. I manage symptoms quietly, every day, and I try to do it without making anyone else uncomfortable. But today, I stopped apologizing for existing, and that shouldn't have to be brave. I hit post. Then I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet again. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I lost track. My body needed rest, but my mind was still caught in the strange wave of it all. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear my neighbors laughing through the wall. The sound was soft, grounding, a reminder that life continued outside this strange new current I'd been pulled into. The next morning, I woke to a phone full of new notifications. News stations were reaching out. Podcasts, talk shows, disability organizations offering to feature me. One email came from the airline's public relations office. They apologized for what happened on the flight, said they were reviewing their policies, and asked if I would be willing to speak to their team about improving disability training for their crew. I stared at that message longer than the others, not because I was surprised, but because it felt like the first door that really mattered opening. Change didn't come from a viral clip, it came from what followed. From conversations and policies and slow, often frustrating work. I typed a simple response. Yes, I'm available, and I'm ready. The days that followed passed quickly. I did the interview with the advocate. I shared more of my story. I listened to others. I watched as people shared the clip not just to marvel at the drama, but to talk about ableism, to talk about compassion, to talk about how often we judge what we don't understand. And through it all, I kept walking. Slowly, sometimes painfully, but always forward. What happened on that flight had hurt me, but it had also reminded me of something I'd forgotten, that I didn't need to shrink to make other people comfortable, that I could take up space, that my voice, even quiet and shaking, had power. I wasn't invisible anymore, and I was never going back. A month later, I sat backstage at a small community theater, the kind that converted old-school auditoriums into lecture spaces and held local TEDx events once a year. There was no grand crowd, no blinding spotlight, just rows of folding chairs and people seated with quiet attention, waiting for the next story. I had been invited to speak after one of the event organizers saw my post online and reached out. At first, I ignored the email. Then I stared at it for days. Eventually, I said yes. The theater wasn't packed, but it was full enough. People had come not because I was famous, but because the conversation had touched something real. Some were disabled, some were caretakers, some were teachers, therapists, college students, people who had read the headlines and wanted to understand more. I hadn't prepared a flashy speech. I had my notes on a worn piece of paper folded into my lap, but I wasn't going to read them. The stage manager gave me a signal. My mic was live. I walked onto the stage slowly, cane in one hand, the other tucked close to my chest. My steps were measured. I knew how to mask the pain, but I didn't bother today. I let them see it. The way I moved, the way I shifted when I stood still. It wasn't a performance. It was the truth. When I reached the center of the stage, I looked out at the audience. The lights were warm, not too harsh. I took a deep breath, then spoke. I want to tell you about a flight I took. There were a few nods in the crowd. Recognition. People had seen the video, read the articles, maybe shared a tweet. I didn't dwell on that part. I didn't need to repeat what they already knew. But before I get into what happened that day, I continued, I want to talk about what happens most days. I told them about grocery stores and elevators, about the strangers who asked, "What's wrong with you?" About the co-workers who smiled when they thought I was exaggerating, about the relatives who told me I just needed to exercise more, about every subtle way people ask you to prove your pain, about the exhaustion of trying to appear acceptable when your body is falling apart from the inside. I have a genetic condition that affects my joints and connective tissue, I said. It's called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, but honestly, the name doesn't matter. What matters is that it isn't visible, not most of the time. I can smile through it. I can hold a conversation through it. I can get dressed and show up and pass. And that makes people question whether it's real. There was no noise from the audience, just stillness, focus. So when someone calls you a liar out loud, in front of strangers, on a plane, you don't just feel anger, you feel confirmation. You feel like everything you've worked so hard to overcome has been yanked back into the spotlight, and now it's on trial. I paused for a moment. My hand tightened slightly around the cane. That day, I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I just stayed in my seat. I said what I needed to say, and I stayed where I was. But what changed everything wasn't just what I did. It was what others chose to do. People around me, some of them hesitant, some of them angry, finally stepped in. And when that happened, something shifted, for all of us. I looked toward the front row. There was a teenager there, maybe 17, with a support dog curled at her feet and a notepad in her lap. She looked up at me like she was holding her breath. I didn't expect to be a symbol. I didn't want to be. But I also didn't want to stay silent anymore. Because every time we let someone like that woman tell us we aren't real, we lose ground. We disappear a little more. And I'm tired of disappearing. I took another breath and softened my voice. We live in a world that expects disability to be visible, dramatic, and clear. But most of us live somewhere in the grey. We live in bodies that work until they don't. In days that start fine and end in pain. We live with doubts and paperwork and the weight of constantly needing to be believed. Then I folded the note in my hand and slipped it into my coat pocket. I didn't get off that flight and change the world. I just got home. I peeled off my braces and sat on the couch and cried. Because standing up for yourself hurts, even when you win. But in the weeks since, I've read hundreds of messages from people with lupus, with POTS, with Crohn's, with ME, CFS, with Lyme, with trauma they don't even have names for. People who saw that moment and said, I've been there. I've lived that. And I'm so tired too. The words sat in the room like a held breath. So I'm here today, not to inspire you, not to educate you, not to ask for sympathy. I'm here because I stayed in my seat. And I want everyone who's ever been pushed out of theirs to know they deserve to sit in theirs too, to take up space, to be accommodated, to be heard, to be believed. I could feel something rising in the crowd, not applause yet, just emotion, shared, quiet, steady. We all have the right to exist without explanation. I stepped back. The lights dimmed slightly. Someone off stage gave me a nod. A moment later, the applause began. Not wild, not chaotic, but sustained, from the front row to the back. Afterward, people lined up to speak. They didn't want autographs or selfies. They just wanted to talk. One by one they came. A mother with a son who used a wheelchair, a teacher with fibromyalgia, a man who had lost his job after requesting medical leave. They all had something to say, and I listened. As the crowd thinned, the teenager with the dog approached. "Thank you," she said, barely above a whisper. "I didn't know how to say what I've been going through, but you said it." She pressed a folded note into my hand and walked away before I could read it. I waited until I was alone, then opened it. The handwriting was shaky but careful. "You made me feel like I belong." That night I sat on the edge of my bed, sore and grateful and utterly changed. I thought about the aisle seat, about the cold glances, the quiet defenders, the woman who grabbed my cane, the flight attendants who didn't look away, the moment the cabin chose to believe me. I wasn't cured. I wasn't a hero. I was still in pain. I still needed rest and braces and hydration, and days where I did nothing at all. But something was different now. I had spoken, and the world had echoed back. And I knew, deep in my chest, that I would never again shrink to fit the comfort of someone who couldn't see my pain. I had earned my seat, and I was never giving it up again.